The last time we were together, if you remember, we talked about the first psalm. And in this reflection, I want to talk to you about the second psalm. And I think you'll find equally so, there's a great deal in it that causes us just to pause and reflect. Psalm 2, out of the New Standard Revised Version, says this: "Why do the nations conspire, and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, Let us burst their bonds asunder, and cast their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath, and terrify them in his fury, saying, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, with trembling. Kiss his feet, or he will be angry, and you will perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Happy are all who take refuge in him." What a difficult psalm in places that is, and yet absolutely incredible in others. If you look at the opening 1 to 3 verses, it builds a picture of antagonism. You could say it reflects something of the human heart towards God. The great reformers used to believe and teach a great deal about what they called the bondage of man's will, by which they meant that after the fall of man, man became captured by, well, we call it sin, a bustedness, a brokenness. And therefore his will, being very much a part of man, was only ever as free as the man's nature was. And I'm using the man, of course, in generic terms for men and women. But we are only as free as our nature. And so because of that, we display something of an inability to touch the heart of God, an inability to travel ourselves towards God and be saved. Jesus put it this way, he said, no one comes to the Father except by me. And so we get a bit of a picture building in there that man needs some kind of external push outside of his own ability to turn him towards God. In this passage, it's talking about the great rulers of the earth, and the psalmist is saying, each of them are conspiring against God. Each of them are loathing God. Each of them have got their little plots and plans to try and overturn God. There's this physical antagonism, tangible rejection that is going on. And yet when you read through, what you find is it probably reflects something of what not only a person who's a non-Christian might think, but some Christians think this. Interesting verse is this. In verse 3 it says, this is speaking about those who are the kings and the rulers who are so against God. Here's their reasoning. Let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. Bonds and cords, interesting words, aren't they? Don't you think they speak about restriction and containment and limitation? Isn't that what a lot of people think about faith? They see it as God telling me what to do, disallowing me from some things, not permitting me to live a certain way, not wanting me to be happy. Bonds and cords, restrictions, ties, things that hinder me from being who I am. I think that's what's driving at the heart of some of these kings and rulers that the psalmist sees. They see God as a restrictor, as someone who's trying to say, do it my way or no way. And having that antagonism against being manipulated or told in that way, they don't want any of that. They want to do it exactly as they want to do it. And of course, what is God's reaction to this? Now, at first, it seems quite offensive because the Bible says this: he who sits in the heavens laughs. It's almost like God's mocking them. But I don't think that's what's going on here. How does God cope with deep rejection and growing antagonism against himself? How would you cope if people were growingly antagonistic and difficult towards you? Being gracious is not the easiest of things, is it? Trying to ignore it and step aside from it is not easy. We find ourselves, even if physically not retaliating, emotionally and mentally we do. We play scenes of vengeance and we fantasize ill coming back on those who were treating us in such a way, and we have all sorts of feelings that wishing them to be paying for what they're saying to us in some way or other. Now, when the Bible says God laughs, what it's saying is that God absorbs and is able to rise above all those, well, comparatively petty programs, because compared to God, much of what we do is very petty. And so God is able to embrace that pressure. He's not insecure about being rejected. And sometimes we think God is. We find ourselves sometimes when we're talking to friends and they really aggressively talk about how waste of time God is and faith is a waste of time. We feel we have to defend God somehow. We kind of jump in with our size 9s and almost say, listen here, don't you talk about God like that, as if God's got some insecurity complex and needs us to defend him. He doesn't. He really doesn't. God is able to absorb a great amount of oppression and antagonism and continue to move forward. And that's exactly where this psalm is heading. Because as you read through, it says this in verse 5, then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, I have set my king on Zion. What is that saying? God is saying to them, despite your plotting and your feelings of animosity and that growing rejection, my ultimate purpose, my foundational kind of goal and destination is still going to happen. I have set my king on Zion. I have done what I intended to do. I have done what I've purposed to do. That's an amazing thought. This is what we classically understand as the sovereignty of God, able to do something far and above what man is unable to prevent. God is a sovereign God, and because of that we take a great deal of encouragement. God's plans cannot be thwarted. In another place, Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell or Hades will not prevail against it. It's a similar thread, it's a similar thought. Jesus is saying, however much antagonism, however much difficulty, I will achieve what I intend to achieve. And this is the great theme of the sovereignty of God, that ultimately nothing can stop God doing what God intends to do. And that's exactly what he's telling each of them here in not so many words. What you get then is something that should be very familiar to all of us. We read these words, you are my son, today I have begotten you. We can remember those from the New Testament, words Jesus himself quoted on. And of course, this is the great messianic glimpse, if you like, or light that shines through. People talk about, and theologians particularly talk about, Christological moments. In other words, pictures of Christ in the Old Testament. Areas where the messianic promise and the kind of moving towards some greater fulfillment is glimpsed through various passages. And you find it right back in Genesis when God promises to crush the serpent's head. It's a promise that one day Messiah will come, deliverer will come, great prophet will come. And in the same way in this verse, God is playing the long game. And this is interesting, isn't it? I'm sure that as the psalmist penned some of these words, he'd have wished that God could, right here, right now, jump on these kings that are being antagonistic and just obliterate them. I mean, let's face it, that pretty much was the Old Testament way of doing things, you know, kill first, ask questions later. But instead, God gives them promises, God gives them assurances. He isn't going to wipe the planet, he isn't going to destroy a nation, but he's telling them that ultimately answers will be found when Messiah comes. And I think this is fantastically encouraging, but also incredibly infuriating for believers, because we want everything today, don't we? Instant is a big word in our culture, and I think some of us struggle with the fact that God does play the long game at times. But as we finish this particular reflection, I want you to notice something, and that is the closing 2 or 3 verses. Listen to what they say. Don't forget, we've already read about how the rulers and kings are venomously antagonistic against God, trying to belittle God, trying to overthrow him, wishing ill of him. We've read about how God has said, in spite of that, what I'm intending to do is going to happen, whether you like it or not. And then it says this, now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear, with trembling, kiss his feet. What is he saying, the psalmist? This is the great theme of God. He is a redemptive God. What do we mean by that? It means that everything God does is never with the intention to destroy or alienate or kind of, if you like, flatten, but it's to resurrect, it's to restore, it's to heal, it's to bring wholeness. Even these antagonistic rulers, the psalmist says, be wise, fear the Lord, kiss his feet, come back. And he finishes the psalm with this wonderful line, happy are all who take refuge in him. That's the key. God is saying, I don't want to sit up here and punish you guys. I don't want to see you being antagonistic and locked horns and locked in battle with me. Come to me and take refuge. You will experience a joy and a happiness. Don't be like those who spend their whole lives fighting a war they're never going to win. You ain't going to beat God. But God says, rather than me taking any delight in getting one up on you, I would take maximum delight if you came to me with fear, with devotion and appreciation, and appreciated and understood the great refuge and resource and comfort that can come underneath God's wing. So as we close this particular study, remember, there are times when even we can relate to these kings, you know. Times when we get angry with God. Times when we wish we could change the timetable or maybe fix something different. But as we do that, let's understand God is sovereign. And he plays the long game, which means sometimes you have to wait, and sometimes you've got to wait a long time. But ultimately, all those, the Bible says, who trust in him are never disappointed. God bless you till the next time.